briefly introduce myself. I do share the same surname with Thomas Kesselring, but as far as I know, we are not related. But you might know more than that. My name is Rita Kesselring. I'm a lecturer of social anthropology at the University of Basel, but I'm also a member of the Swiss ADR, and this is the capacity of being in this panel. So when we organized this workshop, this is the Swiss ADR, but also the Africa Committee and the Center for African Studies, we had specific questions in mind, and we hope that in the end we will have some answers at least to these questions. So the questions I'm raising now should actually take us one step further than we were this morning. Unlike some of the presentations, but also discussions which look backwards, our concern is, of course, looking forward. So I will ask a question, quite a broad question, and then I will give each of you the opportunity to respond briefly. All of you had a presentation, so we know a little bit the background of what you're saying. Apart from Barbara Müller, who is not only here to slightly balance the gender balance on the panel, but in her capacity as Swiss ADR coordinator as well. So our question was really, what are the options now? What shall we start doing on Monday? And specifically in the last presentation, we had some 7 suggestions of how to pursue this issue. We heard the notion of odious debts. Shall we pursue the issue in that regard? Shall we even say that Mozambique doesn't have to repay the debt? Can we go as far? And who should say that? And who should put pressure on whom? So when responding to these questions, please try to be as explicit and as practical as possible. So tell us whether you refer to Switzerland, whether you refer to Mozambique, or to a much more global regulatory environment. I'll start here just because.
So I have to think fast. I'll do my best. Before answering that question, I would like to apologize already that I will probably have to sneak out at about 10 to 5 because I still have a long way to go back into Germany. So I ask for your understanding for this. Thanks for the invitation. It was a great experience, and I appreciate that very much. Hope we can do things together. And this is also the first part of my answer to your question, namely that what we very, very strongly need is a better cooperation among us as civil society, and in this particular case also among us as civil society in potential or real creditor countries to Mozambique and the Mozambican civil society. You may know that 2 weeks down the road there is a bigger conference organized by the Grupo da Dívida in Maputo that will look at broader African perspectives, but also at the particular case of Mozambique. And in our view, an ideal outcome would be to encourage the Mozambican authorities to take unilateral action. We have learned through the history that normally the leeway that debtor countries have in order to take unilateral action before actually they can be, let's say in quotation marks, punished for this, is far bigger than they actually think. Part of the work of the Bank and the Fund consists in intimidating debtor countries and to refrain from anything like individual repudiation of the debt stock as such or of individual loans. But in reality, the money is already in the country, or has been in the country. In this case, perhaps not so much. But the leverage that the creditors have in order to sanction a tougher position from the authorities in the global south is far smaller than people are tending to think. So I would think we all should encourage that Mozambique just not complies with what creditors think about. The notion of odious debts can be extremely helpful in this. International civil society has been working very intensively on this issue like 10 years ago, and we had huge campaigns around odious debts. The concept of odious debts, this has been pushed a bit of the agenda, but as we can see here, or in the cases of the vulture funds that haunted Argentina, there is a huge need to bring that forward again, and a lot of conceptual groundwork has already been made. Nobody of us has to invent any wheels regarding that illegitimacy. Thank you.
Well, I think I can be very brief. It's extremely important to raise public awareness. We should debate on it. We need civil society pressure. We need letters written to the newspapers, to Credit Suisse, to the NGOs who are doing nothing. We need more pressure, and we in Swiss Parliament we go on to ask questions, to deposit this kind of proposals I have mentioned in my speak. We shall try to organize legal action against Credit Suisse, and I do not understand at all Mr. Macamo. I didn't spoke on Mozambique, I spoke on Switzerland. I can't understand you at all. So we are a Swiss political party, and we are addressing the Swiss institutions, Swiss public opinion, and I think this is really a big issue and it needs further action.
I think we call this conference in order to be able to share with others, to bring information together, and also to create networks that will help us to take this thing on. The Swiss ADR campaign as such is a very small organization with very little human resources. All we can do is give an input and try to bring people together, and we hope that from today we can go further. There has been a number of, I think, very useful suggestions made. One is the obvious debt concept, but I think putting pressure on the Swiss government to take a step further. We have heard that there have been debates. That means at least there has been a debate. So we should push that further. And I think the other thing I'm taking home is that continuing pressure on Credit Suisse. And this has to be strategized, and I think we need to sit together. There have been, Mr. Kesselring has, I think he really has the credit for having been the first. And we have benefited a lot from the work he has put together, but we haven't managed to work together. And if we manage to sit together and devise strategies, we may be weak, but I think also what Jürgen said for the South, if we do something, it does have an impact, at least certainly more than if we don't do anything. So I think that could be a starting point from where we go further.
Thank you. So my business, or our business, is basically business to support somehow the population in Mozambique. This is the mandate of the Swiss Development Corporation. Naturally, it has a link to the Swiss, to the Swiss issues, but basically our priorities lie within the support actually of the populations in Mozambique. So there, I would say that the priority in the future would be to contribute somehow to inclusive society building, or in the inclusive, development. This goes then with increasing engagement in governance programs. I just have also to underline that the responsibility somehow to develop Mozambique lies not within the hands of the donors, but basically it's the responsibility of the Mozambican government. So we have to see our top priority is not to support the government, the Mozambican government, but is to support the population and in an inclusive way. So we are going to continue that. So this is my first point. The second one is that yes, as far as we can go within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Switzerland, we are continuing somehow our lobby work in terms of responsible behaving of the private sector in our partner countries. We have some influence, but this influence is also limited, because yes, it's at the end of the day, it's a result of the position of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is a result, as I tried to say, of a discussion of many actors.
I want to start by saying Mozambique already has taken action. It is not paying the debt. As I said, it is not going to pay the debt for some years to come. I think it's unrealistic to ask Mozambique to declare the debt odious, because that requires naming people who are still active politicians within Frelimo. And I think that's an unrealistic thing to ask. Within a country that is still very young, to label as corrupt active politicians, I think it's just one step too far. So I think the Mozambicans have gone as far as they can go by saying they're not paying. I think that the next step has to come from here, and I think it has to come from Credit Suisse, and I think it has to be that Credit Suisse accepts that it has some liability here, that some of this debt will have to be written off, it will have to be the responsibility of Credit Suisse. And I think that means bringing pressure on Credit Suisse here, bringing pressure on the government, putting pressure on SDC, and saying to SDC, if you were to resume the full amount of aid, you're still not up to the full amount of aid, put it through, you could pay teachers, set up a teacher payment agency, it doesn't have to go through the Treasury. Mozambique is trying to set up a child benefit. You can pay the child benefit. There are lots of things that you could do with that money. But if you said we are restoring that money because it was our bank that was responsible, that would change the political balance. And I think the two things that people here could campaign for is restoring the missing aid to Mozambique and using it for social purposes. When I noticed, for instance, that the Dutch government has just moved to give aid for the water supply in Maputo, and has said that FIPAG, which is the government's water agency, is distanced enough from the Treasury to receive money. There are other things which Swiss Development Cooperation could do to put money into Mozambique. So the pressure has to be on SDC to say, we were partly responsible, we, the Swiss, were partly responsible, so we want to restore the aid, and lobbying to get Credit Suisse to accept liability.
Thank you. In my presentation I made 5 points. One was write off the illicit debt. It obviously means that you have to somehow acknowledge that it is illicit. Therefore, it has in Mozambique it has a political implication. Joe spoke about that, which is related to power processes and within Frelimo and so on. So it's not an easy thing to do in Mozambique, but it should be done in order to bring back credibility to institutions, so that you can make that argument. The second point is to restructure the remaining debt. The problem of Mozambique is not the illicit debt only. Illicit debt is a scandal, but if you only focus on scandals, you miss completely the point. The problem of Mozambique, as I tried to present in my presentation this morning, is a systemic question related to the way we are developing the economy. And therefore we need to pay attention to that, otherwise after writing off the illicit debt, we can bring it back very quickly, at least in terms of amounts, if not in terms of illicity, very quickly if we continue in the same path. This was the same problem with Jubilee 2000. You can write off the debt, and if you did that at that time in Mozambique, at that time 20 years ago, you can write off the debt to zero, and the following day Mozambique will owe the world $2.5 million again. So the question is, how do you address the systemic problem? And that needs to be done. It's not something that your civil society organizations here can do. It's a question for us in Mozambique. The third question is related to public financing and the role of the society as a whole in Mozambique related to public financing. We are still not discussing public revenue, where it comes from, how we finance state and public expenditure. We are still not discussing public expenditure priorities. We are still not discussing the procedures in terms of evaluation and taking decisions in Mozambique. We only discuss scandals. We discuss the government spent money on luxury cars, or the government spent money on a luxury plane, and so on. These are the scandals. Well, that's not the main question. I'm not saying that these are not problems. I'm not saying these things don't offend us and our morality and sense of ethics and so on. But if we only focus on that, we are not focusing on many significant issues. So we have to make we have to bring the society to a point where citizens own the state. So we have citizenship active in Mozambique, not only to point to scandals, but actually to demand, claim, and get the role of intervening in the process of discussing these key issues. The fourth thing I mentioned this morning, I can't remember now, and the fifth thing I mentioned this morning was the need to oppose austerity, social austerity in both directions, in both dimensions. One is monetary tightness, and another one was the cutting social expenditure. And we do have very good causes to oppose social austerity, and there are ways to go and move forward. But as you see, all the points I'm mentioning, including the one I forgot, political issues in Mozambique that require a strong political intervention. There is one last point I'd like to raise is, here we have 5 minutes, or 5 minutes now, 2 or 3 minutes, to talk about what we need to do. Remember, you can't do that with a country. You can't tell a country you have 3 minutes to decide what to do. Okay, remember that. You have a whole history to build the idea of a country, and to build the idea of what to do, and we need to respect that. Thank you.
Thank you for reminding us. The round is finished, except that somebody sitting next to the chair has the privilege of having a second contribution, very briefly.
Okay, thank you. I would not want to tell the government in 2 minutes what to do, but I would like to take 2 minutes to make a suggestion in order to put Nulo's proposal into practice. You know, when Argentina was attacked by the vulture funds 3 years ago. Yeah, they had bought cheaply Argentine bonds on the secondary market, had then sued for full payment, and ultimately they won over. And what Argentina did, even before the case was closed, before the US judiciary, was that they started the process in the United Nations General Assembly in order to establish a sovereign insolvency framework for states. And that was something that would never have helped Argentina in this particular case. Even in theory, it never could. But Argentina was the right actor in order to stir up this debate at this moment in time. And maybe there's something to learn from this for Mozambique, even if there is no way that any international intervention should get into the Mozambique Credit Suisse issue. Suggesting that, just as Nulo said, because debt problems are recurring, they are not going away by a HIPIC initiative or one just initiative that wipes out all the debt or particular debt. You need to have, like in legal domestic systems, a reliable, rule of law-based mechanism at work that countries can refer to whenever they need it. And such a scandal with a huge visibility, like we've had this in Argentina before, now with Mozambique, that may be a good moment to use the international political momentum towards reform to say, now we need to get our acts together and work for this. And this is something, it may be bold and look a bit remote, but this is something that Mozambican civil society and the Mozambican authority, the Mozambican parliament could eventually take up. Thank you.
I'm standing next to you.
I just remember what the fourth point was. The fourth point was the renegotiation of contracts with mega projects. I heard recently that we have signed new big agreements with companies regarding oil with something like 20 to 30-year tax exemptions. In addition to the fact that most of these tax exemptions are actually redundant from the point of view of attracting investment and relocating it in the country loses a lot. So this is actually one area, besides the writing off and so on, in which international community can actually support initiatives that come from the country, from inside the country, in order to renegotiate contracts. It's going to be very difficult for the Mozambican government to renegotiate contracts in a situation of weakness, particularly now with the crisis. So you need to get some support, particularly from countries where multinationals come from. And if we remember 2 years or 3 years ago, the G20 summit actually approved a resolution that said that G20 should support developing countries to renegotiate contracts with multinationals in order to retain tax revenues. Because it doesn't make sense that we don't, and then you give us aid to compensate for that. So that is probably something that would be very important for us, because from our accounts, if we do that, we can actually stop things like domestic public debt from increasing, and in doing so, we can change a lot of the structures and incentives within the economy. So it doesn't solve everything, but it's an important factor that has been there for a long, long time, and we are still doing the same things, the same mistakes, partly for fear, partly because of other different issues, and it's necessary to have the support from international organizations as well as the domestic support and initiative to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have an issue that has been occupying me the whole day. It may be not in the systemic field, but the money that was provided by the banks, the 2 billion, were paid to Privinvest completely. So why can Privinvest not be also taken into account? Privinvest was supported, we have seen President Hollande of France. All the money went there, and all they produced for that money was the tuna fishing fleet. So that sounds to me like fraud. And why doesn't it sound like fraud to other people? So that...
I think we'll take up that question maybe in the plenary or bilaterally. I know you're all curious about the answer, but I want to have a few other issues covered. So it's a proposition from the Swiss ADR side. The second question I have is similar, but it's almost like the white elephant, or not the white, just the elephant in the room, quite white, is the pension funds. It was mentioned in many presentations that this is where the money sits. We are all somehow shareholders, the pension funds are involved, but no one has suggested a solution to that problem. At least the Swiss, the English, and many others are intrinsically involved in the whole issue. Does anybody on the panel, not everybody has to answer, have some thoughts on the pension funds and how we can change that structure, or become active as a, I don't know, as a shareholder, for instance, as a citizen?
It's a big issue, and the whole community of states have signed the Paris Agreement, climate agreement, and this climate agreement has two objectives. One is it should not be warmer than 2 or less than 2 degrees, and the second is all international financial flows should be sustainable. So this is these are 5,000 billion a year. So this is a lot of money. Huh? So there is a political obligation to have a political involvement where the big financial flows are going and where they are not going. They should go in a sustainable way. And what is sustainability has been defined by UN Agenda 2030, which has a very broad definition of sustainability. So we have the pension funds, 700 billions, and then we have a second pot, 700 millions again, Swiss National Bank. It's quite a lot of money, but it is not invested in sustainable projects. But we have, of course, a big problem. Pension funds have to create beneficiaries to pay in the end of the day the pensions of our elderly people, and this is I think we really need a public debate on this issue, how we can fulfill the obligation of the Paris Agreement and how can we materialize it. I personally think we should start first with the National Bank and second with the pension funds, because there we have a problem how to finance the pensions.
One of the ways to use the pension funds is to take action against Credit Suisse. The Norwegian sovereign wealth fund owns 5% of Credit Suisse, and there is now a campaign in Norway saying that they should disinvest from Credit Suisse. But there's another more subtle way. All of these pension funds deal with Credit Suisse to buy their investments. This is the way these structures work. So when Credit Suisse was selling the Mozambique bonds, they would phone up all the pension funds and say, we have a sovereign bond, would you like 50 million of it? And they would all say yes. Now, Credit Suisse has lied blatantly in the sale of the Mozambique bonds. Credit Suisse cannot be trusted. In particular, many of these pension funds have restrictions against military investment. We know that the Euro bonds were used for military expenditure. The IMF says so. The Mozambique government says so. So Credit Suisse has been lying to its clients. Therefore, a campaign of the people who have pensions saying you should not use Credit Suisse as an intermediary because Credit Suisse lies to you might have some effect.
One last question, maybe just 1 or 2 answers on it, but it's on research, on the issue, or on these kinds of issues. And I think we saw that certain individuals who work on this case are quite exposed, and we can maybe do it in one way, as Elisio, at least in the morning, suggested, that we in a way need to take a step back and look at trying to understand all the facts and then maybe make a judgment, but look very carefully. Or we can start digging, a little bit like Joe Hanlon was suggesting and doing, and very soon we are confronted with lawyers. So these are maybe 2 different ways of doing research. And it's just a concern of mine. Are there some thoughts on the general issue also about protecting one another, or how to do research on these kind of issues? if not from the panel, there would be.
Yes, but I will seek a bit the orientation of the discussion. So if somebody wants to respond before you.
I think they've said enough.
I will be brief. First, congratulations to the organizers. It was the most interesting workshop I've attended over the last years. I'm not very old, but I've attended a lot. And the most democratic one. The thing that is related to your question, and I wanted to just to say in public, is that I think we really need to repoliticize development. Even that SP members, like Socialist Party here in the Netherlands, I came from the Netherlands for this workshop today, so even there, in Greece, everywhere I know, they use the new terminology imposed after the 1980s by austerity, anyway, creditors, IMF, etc., who imposed austerity measures. And they use the same terms, like governance, not government. They take power relations out of all issues. And I think he mentioned it as well, that they are not technocratic issues. It's not about the complexity, she mentioned it as well, about the complexity of the tools. It's about the simplicity of the goal, and then you try to understand the mechanisms and the dynamics. So I really think that this is the most important thing. Why we abandoned all the traditional analytical tools. And my question is not directly related to the general approach, but do you think there are differences between sub-Saharan African countries like Mozambique today and southern European countries like Greece and Portugal? Because this is going to be my next research plan. Like I'm finishing my PhD and I really want to study this next year.
Anybody some funding? Otherwise, we open up for other questions in the plenary for 10 more minutes.
Just one phrase. What about CASA and Africa Committee put plaint against Credit Suisse? It must be a group, not an individual.
You've seen all the people involved in this room today. Quite a small group.
I think we can take up the suggestion, but we cannot do it alone. And you have to do some strategizing around it. That was my intention, looking at all the issues that have been raised in the various the suggestions that have been made, and to go through it and strategize around it. But I don't think anybody could say today, yes, we do it, because that has to be a joint decision that we have to debate about for quite some time. But we take the suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel that I have a need to speak. Because I'm feeling a bit misunderstood, also in the queries which I made this morning. So I want to state clearly that, the Swiss have all the right in the world to do whatever they want to do within their political system and also with their money. I have no problem with that. Even if that means interfering in other people's affairs, I think you do have that right and you have the power to do that. The only thing which you should not assume is that what you're doing is innocent. It is not. You are not part of the solution. You are part of the problem, so long as we live in the kind of world we live in. And I think this message was made clear this morning by the three presentations we had this morning. The three presentations showed that we are all in this. Joseph Hanlon said that there are no clean hands here. And I think that is true. But Carl Jun also said, and I'm glad that you repeated it here, focusing on scandals is the worst possible way of trying to address structural problems. So I felt that I needed to make that statement. You know, Russia can say that it is only concerned with the population here in Switzerland, but it becomes a factor, and you need to engage with that. You need to consider that, and you have to acknowledge that if it does that, it's not part of the solution necessarily. It's part of the problem.
You can't collect the microphone.
Thank you. For me, I would like to come back at the question about legality and what are the systems to create legality and really to prevent such situation that we discussed today. Because we have observed this in many discussions again and again, that there is a clear moral decision-making, I think nearly above everybody here. What happens is not consistent with morality. And it is against development, as it was said. But at the other side, we have this situation of legality in Mozambique in one way, in Switzerland in one way, and at an international level. And so I would like to see what we are doing. I have heard from a political party present here that they think they have to do more at this level. I think there are these contributions, not so much from the civil society, mainly the NGOs in the development sector, because they are mainly in the question about fundraising than in the political activity. That is, for me, an issue which is also part of the problem. And then on the other side, also the question to you, Mr. Siegfried, what means it in the priorities of development? Because for me, the observation of the case is really a direct showing that if the legality in Mozambique cannot create more security in the sense of what handles the government, in this case, what handles the private, in many other cases, the idea of a free market or capitalism will not function. That is the idea of neoliberalism. And it will not function forever. So I think we can discuss the economic issues as such, but if we have not the legal frame to make this functioning, then we will never get there where we want to go.
Thank you. We have two more questions, and then I'll give all of you the opportunity to answer one or two of the questions. No? Oh, so we have at least one question here.
Mine is rather a comment or reaction to Lizzie. I completely agree that we are part of the problem. But we must not let ourselves be kept from interfering by the fact that we are part of the problem. So if it disqualifies us for action that we are part of the problem will not go away. It has to motivate us to find a world in which we might no longer be part of the problem, but might work together to be somehow part of the solution. So, yes, we are part of the problem, we have to acknowledge this, we have to be humble about whom we are telling what to do. But we also have to, take a step back from being part of the problem, become part of solutions we may find. And scandals are not a good way to analyze structures, but are a good way to publicize structures. And so we should not waste that scandal by telling us that's only a scandal, we have to look at structures. But we can make structures clear by looking at the extremes which come out in a scandal.
And I think the scandal is that it hasn't become a scandal in Switzerland. That's at least what I learned today. Is there another last question, or shall I give back the microphone? So maybe, Barbara, you take the last word, also as a final word from the organizers. Would you like to respond to some of the questions?
Yes, thank you. So, I mean, what are we doing in the countries? I mean, I just have to make one comment. We have to be very clear that the parameters for development have dramatically changed, and that this paternalistic somehow approach of we are telling to these partner countries what they should do, this is definitely over, because, and it's a good thing, because the partner countries have a lot more of option of collaboration with partners who have no, I mean, who have no conditionality. So, I mean, the whole discussion about the future of aid is very much linked also to the changing environment, development environment. And this is just a reality, if we wish it or if we don't wish it or like it. I mean, this is just a fact. Now, our support in this changing environment is, and I only can repeat what I said before, is our value base, the Swiss value base in our support is to contribute to building up inclusive societies. And the inclusive societies would mean that there are different perspectives and different voices in building states and in building structures and building, governance systems. I mean, the time is definitely over where we come with our systems and impose these systems to partner government. So I mean, for me, I mean, making a step back on the whole thing. The fact that these discussions happen here in Switzerland, but also in Mozambique, and they do happen in Mozambique, this is a way on really developing these societies in a good way. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, these issues would even not have been discussed. So I just underline again, this point of supporting, yes, we can say supporting government, supporting population, supporting societies, but supporting voices, the different voices that then can be heard in these countries. This is the main objective of development cooperation. And it's much more about governance than it is about technical issues, supporting, social services, etc.
I am afraid the donor community has used the end of budget support over the past 2 years to become dramatically more paternalistic and definitely to impose new systems on Mozambique. They are at the moment trying to impose alternative systems to the East staff payment systems and others. The transformation is truly dramatic. That wasn't what I was going to say. I was actually going to say something totally different, which is that I think scandal can be, this is a journalist comment really, scandal can be very important for provoking change. It has to go back to analysis that we've already made. It often goes back to debates that we've already had. The debt scandal in Mozambique is leading some of us to draw on 20 years of research on debt. But the scandal itself is important because it provokes action. And if it provokes action against Credit Suisse, and that in turn changes the relationship of lenders, that's really useful. And so I think we shouldn't ignore it just because it's a scandal, rather use it as a way of driving forward.
I'd like to go back to this scandal issue. I think that the scandals as events, as phenomena, should be dealt with. So if 15% of Mozambique's GDP disappeared, now you have to deal with that problem. You cannot say, oh, that's a minor problem because there are still 85% left. So you need to deal with that. The question that I'm concerned is when we only react when there is a scandal and we only focus on the scandal. Because in that case, it doesn't illuminate anything, it actually hides the problem. Yeah? So the big question in Mozambique is not that Guebuza is corrupt. He probably is corrupt. Yeah, but that's not the big problem, because I mean, if the Mozambican country, society, is in the state it is just because one of its members is corrupt, even if he's a president, there is a bigger problem in that society than that. Yeah, so yeah, 15% of GDP disappeared, and it can't be accounted for. It's not that it can't be accounted for; it can't be accounted for, right? Now we need to deal with that, but that is part of a bigger problem. So if we only react when there is a scandal and we only focus on the scandal, then everything else disappears from the analysis, and that's a problem. Yeah, this is focusing on the outcome only, rather than on part of the outcome only, rather than on the systematic or systemic issues. Now, the other thing that I'd like to talk about is about legality and economic development. We are going back to the debate of good governance, that in order to have development, you need to have in place a set of rules that are similar to the rules in Western society, that are the rules governed by neoliberal approaches of the development in those societies. Don't forget that the actual current economic crisis in the world came from your societies. Yeah, don't forget that, right? Don't forget that it was your financial system that destroyed the world economy, and your governments that rescued that financial system at the cost of social austerity for your own people. So don't forget that you have a much bigger problem in your countries, and you have to deal with that. So you are not in any position to say that your system is a good system. Yeah? So you are in a position to learn that systems evolve with the questions that we ask of our own lives, and evolve with our capacity to mobilize ourselves to deal with our own lives. Systems are not rigid things. Unless you understand that, we are going to keep asking everybody in the world to adopt systems that then don't work, that then are not implemented, and so on. Then you yourselves violate, not only with respect to our countries, but with your own country. And you don't deal with that, right? So when you confront your financial system, your governments, and your options that have forced austerity and poverty into your own countries, when you confront that, so you are very welcome to come and help us to confront our situation as well.
I don't have much to add, because that was so profound and clear. I just wanted to say that when we talked about the pension funds, it made me so much aware of how unfair and uneven the structures in this world are. Because I get my pension because my pension fund gets at least 3 or 4% interest rate. And how do they get it? Because we know that if you put your money on the bank, you get 0 to minus interest rate. So we are part of the problem, because we live on that, whether we want to or not, we are part of those who benefit from these unjust structures. So that's something we have to live with it and acknowledge it. But it doesn't prevent us from getting active. And I think the case of Credit Suisse is a possibility to raise these issues, because Credit Suisse is, in its functioning, is a scandal in itself. I just read that they discussed the bank and said, if it doesn't produce at least 5 billion profit in a year, it's a failure. So how can you produce 5 billion profit if it's not taking it from someone? So I think Credit Suisse, we, as a Swiss ADR, we still have Credit Suisse in mind how they acted in South Africa. They were one of the funders of the apartheid regime, and they did not only fund the regime, they defended it. They were actively supporting it. So I think trying to deal with Credit Suisse, it's a big, I mean, we are small, they are big, but nevertheless, I think that's something we should really think about, how we can get into action on that. It has been extremely inspiring to listen to all of you, and it's very rare that you have a conference like today and people stay on past 5. They want to skip lunch. So there is a lot of very positive energy, and I think we take this with us, and I hope it will carry us through the year. Thanks.